Chapter 41. At a little after 11, Pooley stood in the professor's garden, breathing fresh air and pointedly ignoring the weeds which sprouted on the west lawn. The invisible barrier was down, which seemed a hopeful sign, and the sky was blue. At least, Jim assumed it to be blue, for looking up, he remembered that what he was actually seeing was the image projected by the underside of the great stadium, the black star which rose above them. Jim shrugged away the chill which crept up his back, put his best foot forward and strode down to the Swan, the condemned man enjoying a hearty pint being the order of the day. To Jim's amazement, the bar was already quite crowded. The piano was playing and Neville was going hell for leather behind the pump. The part-time barman spied Pooley's approach, as did a shabby-looking man in a greasy brown trilby, who cowered behind his newspaper. "Well, well," said Neville, "the wanderer returns." "What's your mate, Neville?" said the dejected Jim. "And a pint of large, please." "And where's your mate, then?" Neville did the honours at the pump handle. Pooley perused his unpolished toe caps. "I've no idea," he said softly. "Hasn't he been in then?" "No," said Neville. "He's done a bunk." The barman placed the perfect pint before his patron. "Jim, is everything all right?" Pooley shook his head. "Anything but. I don't know what's happened to John. The professor says, 3 more pints over here." The voice belonged to Norman. "Excuse me, Jim, I'll be back in a minute." Neville scooped up the pennies Pooley had placed on the bar and went off to serve the shopkeeper. "He's bunging money about like there's no tomorrow," said old Pete at Pooley's elbow. "I'd dive in now if I was you." "Oh yes, and what's the celebration?" Jim asked, out of no particular interest. "This gravitite business, you know, that wonder crap that holds the stadium up. Norman's knocked up his own version, and you'll never guess what." "He's won the Nobel Prize." "Not yet, but he took his formula down to the patents office, and it turns out that there's no patent on it. The other geezer never got round to having his registered. Norman is sitting on a gold mine." "My old brown dog," said Jim. "Bravo, the shopkeeper." "My thoughts entirely." "What's your mate, Norman?" called Jim along the bar. "As tricks then?" "Never better," crooned the half-drunken shopkeeper. "One for my good friend Jim, please, Neville." "Cheers, Norman," said old Pete. "Nice one, mate." "And another down that in for the fogey." "I never cared for him, you know," old Pete confided in Pooley. "Gets right up my nose, he does." Jim sipped thoughtfully at his pint. "He's all right. He's an individual." "He's a ruddy nutcase. So where's your mate, then? Work shy as ever, it seems." "I don't know. I'm not sure." "Thought he'd be getting some mileage out of these." Old Pete drew out his silver envelope. "Did you get yours?" "What are they?"
3 tickets for the big match. Everybody's got one."
Pooley raised his eyebrows and his glass.
"Everyone in Brentford." "That's the size of it. A bit of good has come out of this fiasco."
"I wouldn't go if I were you," Jim advised. "In fact, I'd give the whole thing a very wide berth."
"My thoughts entirely. Yet again, I'm advertising mine in the Times. There's a bungalow in Eastbourne in this for me. I'll give you a £5 for yours if you want."
Pooley hunched low over his pint, which was shortly joined by Norman's Freeman. "Mine seems to have been delayed in the post. If you want to give me the 5 spot now, I'll drop it round when it arrives."
"Do I look like a cabbage?" old Pete asked. "On your bike, Pooley."
He raised his glass towards the inebriated shopkeeper.
"Good luck, Norman. Here's health."
"So, Jim,"
said Neville, when he had done with his servings,
"what's to do then?"
Pooley shook his head. How could he possibly explain what was going on to Neville? In the cold light of day, it all seemed so much nonsense. He was still not certain that he'd actually seen what he thought he'd seen. It was too grotesque. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that it was some drug-induced fantasy brought on by incense and whiskey. But John, however, remained quite as dead.
I'm not well,
Jim told Neville.
Something I ate or something. As for John, I just don't know. Truly.
I'm sorry you're not feeling up to much, Jim. You said something about the professor before we were interrupted.
It was nothing.
Without Omally, Jim felt pitifully alone, somehow incomplete.
Nothing at all. It doesn't matter.
As you please, replied the barman. But listen, if John does show up, you can tell him he can have his job back here. He played straight with me. I owe him a lot.
We'll do.
Pooley raised his glass.
You are a good man, Neville. There is nothing the matter with mankind when there's blokes like you around.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate that.
You're in a right wet mood, said old Pete. Seen the light, have you? Something like that. Belt up, you old villain. Thanks very much, said old Pete.
There was a sudden disruption in the middle of the bar.
Watch this,
said Norman, clearing space in the crowd.
Now just watch this.
The onlookers and good-time Charlies, who had been accepting his free drinks, drew back to a respectful distance and egged him on.
What you gonna do?
They asked.
A demonstration of the Norman Hartnell Mark I flying jacket. Voila!
Norman opened his coat. Around his waist was a broad belt loaded with lead weights and general junk of the heavy persuasion.
The miracle of Normanite.
Norman unbuckled the belt, and it fell to the floor with a loud crash.
Up and away!
To master amazement, he rose from his feet and drifted towards the ceiling.
He leaps tall buildings in a single bound,
the shopman called down to his speechless spectators.
Rutty idiot,
muttered old Pete.
My glass is empty yet again.
Give the man his due, said Neville. That is not the kind of thing one sees every day.
Norman bobbed about on the ceiling, giggling foolishly. To Pooley's rear, the shabby-looking man in the greasy brown trilby rolled his newspaper into a tight tube, inserted something dubious into the end, and placed it to his lips.
For he's a jolly good fellow, sang the crowd, and so say all of us.
If he throws up on my carpet, he'll pay for the cleaning, said Neville.
Pooley, look out!
Jim ducked instinctively. Something whistled past his left ear and thudded into the haunches of a souvenir Spanish bull upon the bar shelf.
"Stop that man!"
cried Neville, but the crowd was too entranced with Norman's antics. The shabby-looking man fled the Swan.
"It's a blowpipe dart,"
said the part-time barman, examining the bull's punctured rump.
"By the gods!"
That swine Bob is not giving up.
Pooley climbed to his feet.
Thanks very much, Neville.
The barman sniffed at the end of the dart.
"Carrare," he said. "He was out to kill you, Jim, and in my pub. The bloody cheek."
Old Pete chuckled. Pooley had nothing to say.
"Carrare," said Neville. "A distillation from the Amazon plant Camaraccio apollodorus. The natives boil up the tubers and the roots, you know. The poison maintains its potency for years. A single prick and you've less than a minute to say your prayers. Attacks the central nervous system, you see."
"Thank you," said Jim. "I'd no idea you harboured an interest in toxicology."
"I did a night school course at the Art Centre," said the barman. "From their poisoner in residence. Funny what you remember."
"Oh, dead amusing, yes. And how are you on anti-gravity? Your man Norman looks to be in some difficulty."
Indeed, the floating shopman was exhibiting signs of extreme discomfort. He was flattened against the ceiling and now very red in the face.
"Oh, help!" wailed Norman. "Get me down, for God's sake!"
Neville sighed deeply and climbed onto the bar counter, disciplinary knobkerry in hand.
"Take hold,"
he called. Norman gripped the knobkerry. The onlookers gripped the barman's ankles. Amidst much puffing and blowing and with no small utterances of profanity, the zero-gravity shopkeeper was returned to terra firma and the weighted belt was hastily clamped once more about his waist.
"It's handy stuff, though," said Norman breathlessly. "Got it sewn into the jacket, you see."
The onlookers saw. "Clever," they said, wondering if the source of the free drinks had now dried up.
"You are a genius, Norman." "A large brandy on me for Mr. Einstein," said Pooley, pressing his way through the crowd.
"My thanks, Jim,"
Norman checked his belt. Perhaps in my zeal I overdid it. I shall have to watch the walk home, or I could end up in orbit. Norman, said Jim, could I have a word or two with you in private? As many words as you wish, Jim. What's on your mind?
Pooley led the shopkeeper away to a quiet corner. The onlookers looked on in disgust and purchased their own drinks.
A small word, said Jim. And why not? Norman tapped his nose. From one millionaire to another. Ah, you heard about my bet. There's not much stays quiet in Brentford. I do live next door to Bob, after all. Quite so. But listen, Norman, this Normanite of yours, a man wearing such a flying jacket could, I suppose, drift up to the stadium, could he not?
Norman looked doubtful.
If the wind was favourable, I don't think I'd care to take my chances, though. You could end up, well, up, indefinitely speaking.
Jim gave a thoughtful nod.
Somewhat dangerous, yes, I agree. It's a pity, though. What are you up to, then, Jim? Not me, said Pooley, the professor. He wants to get a look at the stadium before it opens. Some matter of public safety, I believe. He's got his free ticket, hasn't he? I understand he'd like a private viewing. He's a man of some influence. Can't he swing it with the organisers? I don't think they would approve. This is something of a secret operation. Ooh.
Norman placed a finger to his lips.
Mum's the word, eh? Well, I might be prevailed upon to... To what, Norman? To drive him up. What? A little top-secret project of my own.
Norman spoke in the conspiratorial whisper much favoured by conspiratorial whisperers.
I've done a bit of conversion job on the old Morris Minor. The Hartnell Harrier is now the Hartnell Air Car.
Pooley shook his head. The man was a genius.
A revolution in personal transportation with almost limitless potential in the fields of haulage, commuter carriage, intercity travel, etc., etc. Another first for Hartnell International. Does it work? Does it work? How dare you? It's a bit Spartan at present, only a prototype, but when they start rolling off the production line, I've come up with some great little modifications.
Norman rattled on with boundless enthusiasm.
A single tiny switch which cuts out those annoying red dashboard lights that always come on when you're halfway up a motorway. Rear headlights to revenge yourself on those blighters who come up behind you at night with their main beams on. A sweetie dispenser, in-car commode, automatic pilot, self-contained.
You don't waste any time once you've an idea in your head, Pooley put in hastily, to staunch the verbal flaw which showed no immediate signs of abating.
There's no time like the present, Jim. A lot of it is still in the ideas stage, but the car does work, I'm telling you.
And would you be prepared to take the professor up to the stadium?
Why not? I'd like a sneak preview myself. There are also one or two matters I'd like his advice on. Tit for tat, eh? I'm sure he wouldn't mind. I'm sure he wouldn't. When's he want to go? Norman asked.
Tomorrow night. How's that sound?
The night before the games start.
What? Said Jim.
They brought them forward. Yeah, it was announced this morning. Didn't you know?
No, I did not.
Oh dear. Jim chewed upon his knuckles. There's no sweat. The car will be ready. Sounds like a bit of an adventure. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Norman raised his glass. It was empty.
Want another, Jim?
I'll get them, said Pooley. Another pint.
Nah, just a light ale. I don't want people thinking I'm a heavy drinker. Light, heavy, get it?
Norman tapped at his weighted belt and giggled foolishly.
Can't keep a good man down, eh? Good man down. There I go again.
He creased up with mirth.
Norman, you are a caution,
said Pooley, taking the glasses up to the bar. As he stood waiting to be served, he pondered upon the rare coincidence that Norman had conceived and constructed the very means by which he and the professor could enter the stadium exactly when it was required, and that Jim should just happen to bump into him at that very moment. Many would argue that such a chance was 1 in a million, improbable to the point of near impossibility, and they would no doubt be absolutely right.